So 60 years ago, in February 1963, a book was published by an unknown suburban housewife with a budding career as a journalist. The phrase feminine mystique was coined by Betty Friedan to describe the then accepted assumptions that middle-class white women would be fulfilled by housework, marriage, their sexual lives, and children, or as Gail Collins put it, a set of reproductive organs in heels. But in documenting the widespread dissatisfaction of many of those women in the 50s and 60s, the problem that had no name, Friedan set out to show that women wanted something more than husbands, children, and homemaking. An instant bestseller, The Feminine Mystique struck a chord in the lives of millions of women, and Betty Friedan became either a hero or villain to countless budding feminists, their pissed-off mates, and many, many others. By the time she had co-founded the National Organization for Women in 1966 and led the 1970s strike for equality when 50,000 women marched down Fifth Avenue to Bryant Park, how many of us were there? Betty was already a lightning rod. The lesbians hated her for dubbing their movement the Lavender Menace. Her longtime split with Gloria Steinem and Bella Abzug was legendary, and young black women today resent what they call white feminism. Still, Betty Friedan remains the only revolutionary figure who both wrote the groundbreaking theoretical book that ignited a movement and also became a leader of what became the second wave of feminism. So tonight we have 3 generations of feminists to discuss Betty, the book, what it means to all of us, and where the feminist movement is today. Muriel Fox, a former public relations executive, was co-founder of NOW and Betty's main lieutenant for many years. She has lived the history and is superbly equipped to recount the good and the bad about the mother of the movement. Muriel will tell all in her forthcoming book, The Women's Revolution, Who Did It, and How We Changed Your Life, which will be published next year. Brittney Cooper is a tenured professor of women and gender studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, and an author, activist, and cultural critic. She's a co-founder of the Crump Feminist Collective and the co-editor of essays by the same name, which explore intersectionality, African-American culture, and hip-hop feminism. Brittney says she came to feminism through black feminist professors who didn't teach Friedan other than to disagree with her. Rebecca Traister is a senior contributor. Rebecca Traister is a senior contributor to New York Magazine, where she covers politics, media, and culture from a feminist perspective. She is also the author of Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. Rebecca says that by the time she read Friedan, I was already reading her with a critical lens, and the world she described felt very narrow and very distant from the one in which I had grown up. Our moderator is Lynn Sherr, the longtime ABC journalist, author, and as she says, a grateful beneficiary of what the feminist mystique inspired. We both are, which is why we decided to put together this panel. Lynn and I came to feminism through covering the movement as it was happening. Lynn, then at the Associated Press, and myself at Newsweek. In March 1970, the new feminism inspired me to join with my fellow Newsweek female researchers to file the first sex discrimination complaint in the media. After that, women journalists at every major media organization demanded equal rights and opportunities, and for the most part, won them. I wrote about this case. I wrote about our Newsweek case in my book, The Good Girls Revolt, which was also the basis of an Amazon series of the same name. So no matter how old you are, feminism has changed our world and changed our lives. And tonight we will discuss the origins of second wave feminism, the woman who sparked it, what's changed, what hasn't, and why. And we can't wait to hear about your own encounters with the feminine mystique. So please welcome this terrific panel.
Thank you, Lynn. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. I'm really glad you're here. And I want to tell you very briefly why I'm here. And I'm going to look at my notes because I had to write down some statistics that even I find astounding today. As a woman in the 1960s, we could not get a credit card, an apartment, a high-paying job, the chance to seek a good job, or an abortion without severe restrictions or flat-out barriers. In 1970, the year of the strike that Lynn mentioned, we took home just 59 cents for every dollar that a man earned. We held just 22% of all faculty positions in institutions of higher education, 9% of all scientists' jobs, 7% of physicians' jobs, and 3% of all lawyers' jobs. We had then, 1970, elected no female governors or big city mayors, no woman in the U.S. cabinet at the time. We had no women on the Supreme Court, only 10 in the House of Representatives, and 1 in the U.S. Senate. And of course, no woman was an astronaut, a rabbi, a commercial airline pilot, a firefighter, an army general, or deemed eligible for combat. And of course, it went way, way, way beyond the numbers. Advertisers used naked female bodies to sell everything from cars to lingerie. Airlines promoted sexy stewardesses to entice male travelers. Office managers looked at a potential secretary's body before her resume. So I am here because of the confluence of Betty Friedan's book and the movement it inspired, which was rooted in the enormous energy and momentum of the civil rights movement that came before. The second wave women's movement was rooted in the civil rights movement, exactly how the suffrage movement was rooted in the abolitionist movement. One came after the other. And in both cases, they opened up the world. In our case, it opened up the world for women. And it created a new class of heroes. For example, Colorado's Pat Schroeder, who first ran for the House of Representatives in 1972 with the slogan, "I have a brain and a uterus, and I use them both." And our own hero, Muriel Fox, who not only found her own path, but made sure the rest of us walked in the same way as well. So Muriel, let me start with you. How did you come across the book and Betty? How did you find them both?
Well, in 1963, I did have a successful career and a happy marriage, but I knew when I read that book that it was going to change lives for women and was going to change the world. And every time I walked down a street with Betty Friedan or sat in a restaurant with Betty Friedan, a woman went up to Betty and said, "You changed my life." She changed millions of lives.
What was it in particular? Can you say?
Well, yes, and I want to remind everybody what her original title for the book was before it became The Feminine Mystique. It was The Educated Woman, Her Problems and Prospects. She was not talking about all women. She was talking about educated women who had a college education and were expected to adore their life as a servant to their children and husband, who was the person who was running the world.
And the marriage.
And the marriage, right. But the Supreme Court ruled that the husband is the marriage.
Right.
You pointed out all the
in
problems.
Blackwell's common law, that the husband and the wife are one, and that one is the husband. That was what this country was founded on. Yeah.
So, but incidentally, Betty Friedan was not co-founder of NOW. She was the founder. I was a co-founder. Betty is the one who did it, and I hope everyone will remember that. You know, and her. memorial, I said, Betty Friedan was not a good woman, but she was a great woman. And people have to remember, she gave now its name. She gave us our statement of purpose, our mission, our energy, our strategies. It was Betty Friedan, and I just hope history will remember her. I get very upset when young people today say they never heard of Betty Friedan.
I have to, you talk about now, and I want to talk about your role in it. Now, of course, was the National Organization for Women. As a reporter, I must have interviewed Betty probably 3 times a day, if not more, during those years, and I'm sure Lynn did as well. But a lot of the reporters got the name wrong. They would write National Organization of Women. That was the comment. And Betty once said to one of them, "It's for women. Don't you understand? We are for women." That's how to remember it. That was Betty, right?
And we had a lot of men, so it wasn't the Organization of Women. We had some wonderful men in NOW.
Right. So what was it like working with her, or did you work with her? Or
Yes, I was her lieutenant, and she was impossible. She was a horrible human being. She had a terrible temper. She hung up on the press all the time, and was self-centered and hostile. But Betty Friedan is the one who did it. She is the one who changed our lives and our history.
What was her goal? What would you say was the thing she really wanted to do?
Change the world, and she did.
When you say she was horrible, I could give a few examples too. I'm not going to. Give us an example. Tell me what was horrible about working with her?
Well, she had a bad temper, and she was paranoid. She, thought everybody was an agent out to get her. Some people were agents, by the way, of the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. And she just didn't try to be nice. But that's okay, because she changed the world.
So if I say to you, what did she do right? Your answer is going to be she changed the world. But what specifically in terms of tactics, in terms of how she did it?
She had the vision. The first vision was that woman should be a partner of man. And she always talked about being partners, not enemies. And her vision was that the society up until then was bad for our sons as well as for our daughters. And she understood this. And she understood, really, her statement of purpose. I urge everyone to read it. You get it from the NOW website. It expressed everything. In addition to all those statistics you mentioned, it said everything we were trying to do to create, as she put it, full partnership, an equal partnership of women and men.
What did Betty do wrong?
What she did wrong was just be nasty to everybody.
Well, but in terms of the movement, Lynn mentioned in her introduction the Lavender Menace.
Yes.
She really blew the LGBTQ,
Yeah.
which didn't exist as a phrase at the time, but she was not good to gay women.
No, she started out really vilifying lesbians. She evolved. We all evolved. We were such a small new movement. We made mistakes, and we learned. And I mean, at the beginning, I didn't think abortion should be an issue, but we evolved. We learned, and now, by the time in 1971. When we had evolved, we passed the resolution saying that lesbianism is a feminist issue. And in later years, Betty apologized for what she had said, and she supported lesbian rights. We evolved. It was a small new movement. We were making history.
Right.
And we didn't get everything right, but how could we?
I would say one of the things that she did wrong, that we did wrong, as I'll take some responsibility for the way we covered it, was in our effort to get more rights for housewives and to get them out of the house, we managed not to honor the women who actually liked being housewives and who cherished the work and whose work we honor, as I honor my mother's life, and I suspect most of you do as well. That was also a big mistake. We pushed them aside.
Right, and also we used to use the phrase working women, meaning women who worked for money. And needless to say, homemakers are working women. So then we learned to say women who work outside the home or women who work in the home.
Right. And of course, there is the issue of race, which we'll get into in just a minute. So, okay. So with all of the mistakes, we did something. You did something. We followed along. We did our own part of it. We wrote, we battled, we cheered. And then we had the naive thought that it was all done. We did it. We fixed everything. And astoundingly, in a moment of great timing, the woman who just won last week the Nobel Prize for Economics, Claudia Golden of Harvard, has just published a working paper with it about the impact of women in the workforce, and it's called Why Women Won. And in it, she says, and I quote, "Of the 155 critical moments in women's rights history that she compiles, 45% occurred between 1963 and 1973. The greatly increased employment of women, the formation of women's rights associations, the belief that women's votes mattered, and the unstinting efforts of various members of Congress were behind the advances." Amazing. We did make progress. But as the next generations pointed out, we actually missed a few things, especially since many of them had never read the book. Brittney and Rebecca were actually born before the book came out, but caught up.
No.
After.
No. After.
Before the book,
After.
before you were too young to read it. Yes. Rebecca, you've got a personal story about the book, though, about how you came into it.
Only as how I came into it. I was born in 1975, so I was born 12 years after its publication, and I was raised in a house where my mother was a college professor, my father was a college librarian. She made more money than he did. I came to the book in high school as part of probably, I don't think I must have read it in high school as part of a history class or something. And when I brought it home to read it, my mother, my mother made more money than my father. But she was not, I wasn't raised in a household that was like second wave feminist in nature. My mother had grown up on a very remote and rural potato farm in northern Maine with very conservative Republican parents. And when she had gone to college in the early 1960s, she had begun to have her brain exploded, right? And had taken a turn left. And I grew up in a very left-leaning household, but she had actually always been much more animated by a civil rights struggle than by the women's movement. I did not grow up with second wave rhetoric in my house. I grew up in a house that had been made possible by the second wave, but I didn't hear a lot about feminism directly from my mother. But when I brought home The Feminine Mystique, she said, "Oh, Betty Friedan, boy, do I have a story about her." Okay. So she had been an undergraduate at Colby College in Maine, and she had read The Feminine Mystique. And her mother, a farm wife, who happened to have gotten a degree and a master's degree in biology in the 1930s, and then had come back to her rural Maine town, married, gotten a job as a high school teacher, married, and then stopped working to be a housewife, and had been incredibly depressed and had a series of, I think agoraphobia, anxieties that had really made an impression on my mother, who was her oldest of 3 children. And then when my mother was 10, a local teacher died, and her mother had gone back to work as a biology teacher, and everything had changed about their house. Everything had changed about their house. So my mother, when she gets to college, in the good way, my grandmother had become happier and a better mother and a happier human being to live with, and everything had gotten better. So when my mother read The Feminine Mystique when it came out, she was electrified by it. She was so excited, and here she was from still an undergraduate, just beginning to form her changed political opinions. And Betty Friedan came to campus to tour as part of what would be her tour. And my mother got the assignment of taking her around campus for a day and a half, she said. It was traumatizing to my mother. It was complete. Now, she interestingly associated, it was also at college that she met my father, who was a Jew from the Bronx. But Betty was, I'll say this in this context, one of the first, what my mother said to me delicately, New York people she'd ever met. And she was like, sometimes I wondered if I just wasn't used to her tone. I didn't know your father's family at that point. Anyway, I love my mother. I don't mean that voice to be, it's an affectionate voice that I use. She's brilliant. She's wonderful. But she took Betty around to this college campus, and her distinct memory, she said she was impossible, horrible, nasty to her, this like eager young farm girl who was having her mind open. And then she took her to see like a chamber music concert where there was one woman in it, I don't know, a string quartet or something, and there was one female student who was in this, and Betty grabbed the woman behind as they were about to go out on stage and perform, and started haranguing her. How do the men treat you in this group? Are you in front of everybody? And the student was like, everything's fine. And Betty was holding her hand and keeping her back and saying, no, you have to tell me, are they disrespectful to you? Do they keep you from playing? Do they give you the good musical parts? And meanwhile, the entire rest of the chamber music ensemble had gone on stage to perform, and Betty was holding back the female member. So anyway, my mother told me this as the day I brought the book home to read. And it was a great backstory. And then I read it, and I will tell you that I thought it was, in high school, dull. It was boring to me. It didn't have, and this was the early 1990s. It was a period of intense anti-feminist backlash that I had been raised through the 80s and early 90s.
Did you at that point consider yourself a young feminist?
Absolutely. I was I wasn't an activist by any stretch of the imagination, but I was in all my academic work in high school and then through college. I did all of my reading through a feminist lens. I didn't yet have any good racial or class analysis. I was pitifully behind on that. But I did consider myself a feminist. I was very interested in abortion rights from middle school. But this book at that time did nothing for me. There were two things that I remember one thing it's like in a movie, I would come back later to this thought, 30 years later, which was that I did understand reading that book that she was describing, it was presented to me in the class as here was this explosive move forward, right? The beginning of the feminist movement. And I read the book and I was so confused because she was describing backlash. She was describing regress in that book. And I didn't have any of the historical context of what had happened generations previous. And I didn't make much of it, nor did I find it particularly fascinating then, except this is confusing because I thought this was the whole propellant move forward. But in fact, the circumstances she's describing are like all about backward motion. And that was like a thought that I would come back to literally probably 25 or 30 years later when my work as a journalist took me back to Friedan and The Feminine Mystique with more historical grounding and more of my own journalistic exploration about what was going on that produced this.
In a phrase, now, how do you see the book?
I see it as an incredibly crucial historical act. I see it as a thing that was catalytic. I also understand the critiques of a million critiques, but even of its role as being the first, because I now have read enough to understand that there had been other people making these arguments. Simone de Beauvoir, obviously, Sadie Alexander, who was a black woman who was making these arguments about the health of marriages when women earned wages outside the home in the 1930s. But I also understand the role of a popularizer. And I was raised on the Betty and Gloria myth, being told that Gloria was the popularizer and that Gloria made everything glamorous and digestible. But I think Betty was a real popularizer with that book, because she took ideas that were they were being voiced by lots of other people, and she just made them explosive and available to such a huge audience that they could be a spark.
And the fact that also it was, as Lynn mentioned in her introduction, the problem that had no name, that she put her finger on something that up until then had not been fingered. It had not been identified.
Can I define, because I just read in her book the definition of the problem that has no name. It is that women had not fulfilled their human potential. That is the problem that has no name.
Right.
And that is what she said we must solve.
Okay, Brittney, you just now, I mean, like 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, read the book.
Yeah.
Would you give us a little book report, please?
Well, what I'll say is, I mean, I'm still reading. It's a big ass book. What I'll say is that I did not learn feminism from white women. And in fact, I learned it from black feminist professors when I was a graduate student. And so, for instance, I was trying to remember where I had learned my enmity for Betty Friedan. And I realized that I learned it from Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks opens the 1984 book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center, excoriating Betty Friedan. It's literally the first chapter of the book, and saying that she is talking about white women. She is not talking about, so when she talks about the ennui that these middle class white housewives have, she doesn't ever consider who would then come in to do the work as these women go out into the workforce, right? That there are, and at that point, and for most of American history, when black women are in the labor force, they primarily worked as domestics. And because I come from a family where multiple generations of women, in fact, I'm the first generation of women in my family that never did work as a domestic, right? And I was born in 1980. So I learned black feminism and feminism more generally with this black feminist critique about the limitations of Friedan. That, in fact, so there's this argument then that Friedan makes where she says all of the good things that happened in the women's movement ended in 1920 with the vote. When she's writing in 63, she is looking back to the suffrage movement and saying those women were different, those women were catalytic, those women had the kind of moxie and passion and sense of the future that she was missing in her generation. The problem was, of course, that literally is how we then came to teach the waves. So when I teach a feminism class, I say the first wave is from 1848 to 1920, Seneca Falls to the vote. And then I say the second wave begins in 1963 with Betty Friedan. And what black feminists said is black women were organizing the whole time. They were organizing before 1848. They were talking about gender. They were organizing between 1920 and 1963. And so I learned Friedan as a person who, because it seemed like she changed the world, had then invisibilized centuries of labor that black women were doing. That was the context that I came to the book. So then I read it and am still reading it. And
I think it's good, by the way, to have a concept about a book without reading it.
I don't know that that's true because a lot of people on social media have lots of opinions about things they haven't read.
I'm teasing you.
Right? But so I come to the book. The thing that I think about it in this moment, I think that Bell Hooks is a little bit unfair. And what I mean by that is that I think that there is an angst about being a housewife that happens at mid-century, that happens after World War II, as women across races and classes are trying to figure out their role in this new economy where America's a superpower, where Fordism, the sort of auto worker strikes, all of that stuff that comes out of World War II, they have invented the middle class. So you have a rising black middle class that also comes out of World War II, right? Because FDR and Truman are on the front lines of desegregating federal employment. That creates a Black middle class. And with that, you then have Black women who have different choices about their lives. So when I began to read Friedan, I said, oh, wait a minute, this actually does remind me of a series of things that are happening in Black communities where folks are like, well, what do we do about these Negro woman intellectuals, right? They have, and there's like this article in Ebony a couple of years after the Feminine Mystique comes out, where someone says the Negro woman intellectual, one of her jobs is to have ideas, but her other job is to define a new definition of the feminine. And for me, that seems to be a Black community taking up the implications of what the feminine mystique is trying to think about. So what I don't like when we try to think about movements together is a world where Black feminism gets rendered as being the sort of oppositional force. I don't even typically use the term white feminism. I think it's ahistoric. I tend to prefer mainstream feminism. That's how I think about it. And that's a way to also talk about these kind of liberal feminists that were actually fairly multiracial, particularly in the 60s. I write about Pauli Murray, who is one of the folks who helped to found NOW, right? And so I don't like a Black feminism that becomes the reaction to white feminism, because I think that that's not what Black feminists have been saying. What they have said is we were always here and always working. And when I read Friedan, I think the smart thing that she is talking about is, what then do we make of middle-class women? And I think that that's a perfectly legitimate place to begin a conversation. It doesn't end there. And I think that part of the challenge is that in her intense focus on middle-class white women, one gets the sense sometimes that she doesn't know how to apply her critiques of Freud, for instance, to working class women, right? Or her critiques of ennui, like the drudgery of doing domestic work every day for families that don't see you. Why doesn't she think that that kind of drudgery might also inspire a sense of deep despair about one's own social condition? So that's like a limitation of Friedan. But the book itself is a very smart take on the way that the media comes in at mid-century and gaslights women and tells them that they're the problem, and then says, you just need to be happy with your home life, right? Mm-hmm. And they're still doing it. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's why when I read it, I was like, I'm actually not mad, because I get the sense of what she's trying to do. And I don't think she's disrespectful to Black movements. I see her name checking those movements throughout the book. And she specifically says these white women's movements are galvanized by abolition, are galvanized by civil rights. And I think we can say that and also recognize that when someone like Bell Hooks is excoriating her, she is doing that because Friedan begins to take up so much psychic space in the feminist movement that Black women have to be pugilistic in order to make space to be heard, right?
Go ahead. I also want to say, and I may be wrong, and there may be people in this room who can correct me if I'm wrong. I want to say that in 1972, a year I've paid a lot of attention to, Betty was the feminist who was supporting Chisholm when Gloria and Bella could extract a deal from McGovern. It was Friedan who continued to say, why aren't we supporting Shirley Chisholm?
And can I point out one other thing? When you talk about the need for help in running the home so that the woman can work outside the home, the magic word is childcare. And we cannot do it without childcare, and we still need it.
One of my critiques of Friedan, though, I would say, is a gendered critique, which is that the argument wasn't that we extract new terms with men, right? Like that's where the idea that you create, and absolutely childcare, but another element of that is, why aren't the women leaving those domestic and familial posts at home doing so in partnership with men who we can write a new deal with and say, wait, we're in this part together. So yes, all for childcare.
Well, that's all Betty said. She always said we're in it together. She was criticized for talking about being in it together with the men.
But you know that white women at mid-century, the people who came in and took care of their kids were Black women. And I know those were the women who did it because those are the women who raised me.
Right.
And those women took care of the white women's kids in my community.
We need
And
society.
probably raised up some of the women in this room as well.
Correct.
But today, of course, we need society to give us child care. We need good child care centers for everyone.
And the people who will still be doing that child care when the federal government finally gets some sense and gives us public daycare will still be Black and brown women. Because we have created a societal structure where that is the place where they enter, where they do care work. And so here's the thing that I want to hold, Muriel. I want to hold that Betty Friedan can be smart, can be galvanizing, can be catalytic, can be incisive, can be right and still be limited, right? That she did name a problem. Now, was she the first person to name it? No. Was she a person that named it in a way that, because here's a political priority for me. I'm here for anybody that can radicalize white women. Mm-hmm. I actually think my life gets better as a Black woman when white women get it, right? So anybody who wants to write books and be like, hey girl, this is actually, patriarchy is not working out for you, and these white boys don't love you, and they will throw you under the bus the minute they can. Hello, Dobbs. Right? Like, we already know that white patriarchy is no country for white women either. So I'm not mad, right, that Betty Friedan writes a book that helps white women to because it has to happen in every generation. And she says it. She is like, these white women, they look in abolition and they see these Black women and Black folks being treated terrible. And they're like, wait a minute, this language helps to explain my own condition. In fact, I am civilly dead, right? And so that has to happen in every generation. And real talk, it needs to happen in this generation. We would be in a very different political position if white women, housewives in the suburbs who are doing the bidding of the Trump generation got radicalized again.
And what a brava! And you lead perfectly into another quote from Claudia Golden, the Nobel laureate, in her "Why Women Won" working paper, and I quote, "But women soon became splintered by marital status, employment, region, and religion far more than men. A substantial group of women emerged in the 1970s to oppose various rights for women, just as they did during the suffrage movement, and they remain a potent force today." And Rebecca, I want to turn to you on the issue of white women who are anti-feminist and white women who are, you should pardon me, pro-Trump.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's always going to be the biggest incentives within a white patriarchy for the white women who are willing to be the foot soldiers of that patriarchy. I mean, there's a lot on offer for those women. There is money, there's power, ancillary power. And white women are incredibly valuable to a brutal white patriarchy in defending it against anybody who's going to challenge it, but especially, so Brittney and I have spent a lot of time over the years talking about this. One of the reasons that Brittney says it's so necessary for white women to become radicalized and understand their position is because white women have resources within a white patriarchy, right? Yep. So they have access, and look at the things that have happened even in recent years as we see segments of those white suburban districts where women who'd been apolitical post-Trump became radicalized against Trump, and that's where you see major gains on local and state elections, right? Because white women tend, because of the unequal way in which power and resources are distributed, those white suburban women are more likely to have the money, the time, the social reach, the ability to go out and do that kind of organizing work. The question is, and so I have a political operative friend who said to me after 2016 something like, white women, it's the ball game. Well, a white patriarchy knows the power of radicalized white women, and so they want to further incentivize those white, their foot soldiers to be the enemies of those radicalized white women. Like, all the incentives are there. They're all, a lot of the ways in which, I was really interested in what Brittney said about the creation of the Black middle class via government policy, right? Because that is, when I said that 25 or 30 years later, I would come back to that regress element of Friedan's work. when I did learn about the politics and social movements of the late 19th and early 20th century, yes, around abolition and suffrage, but also around the expansion of educational opportunity, the opening of schools. Now, white women and black women were not always working in perfect unity. There were terrible, terrible, decades-long splits between them. But there was a period during Reconstruction and then in the early 20th century, the progressive era, in which what you saw were black women and white women taking up spaces professionally, educationally, that they had never been in before. The opening of schools that admitted female students and black students, there was a sort of progression into spaces. And then what I had always been taught was the lead up to the circumstances of the feminine mystique was just, the wars, and then the men came home, and so then there was domesticity.
There is that about after the war, the women, there was government policy to get the women back in the kitchen.
But not only that, there was government policy to create a largely white middle class where government was literally buying homes in suburbs that were restricted to white families. Government was subsidizing housing. The GI Bill, which white returning soldiers could take advantage of far more easily than black returning soldiers. Obviously, union protections that were strengthened during the New Deal, but that union membership at that time was largely white. All kinds of, the government was investing in creating a middle class that was going to be largely white. And at the same time, the government was also investing in those suburbs, building roads that cut off black neighborhoods to shuttle those white men to their suburban homes that were partially paid for, right?
Well, thank you, Robert Moses.
Right.
All that.
Cutting off black neighborhoods, and those black families that were not being ushered into the middle class, which is what Brittney described, right? So many more urban black communities were being cut off by the government investments in a white middle class, from transportation, from jobs, from business centers. And when I wrote a book 7 or 8 years ago about unmarried women and the changing marriage patterns in those years. And one of the things you see is that white women, as the government is investing in them, literally becoming housewives, buying their houses and protecting men's jobs. You see marriage rates for white women go way up and marriage ages go way down. So all those schools that they were set, and there's a whole media attacks just saying you got to start dating. The invention of dating is that period in the early 20th century, and the sort of medical diagnosis of homosexuality or just not being sexually active as perversions, right? So you're encouraging...
Frigid was a big word.
Frigidity, right. And that's all directed at white women through like women's magazines and everything. And at the same time, you see black marriage patterns change too. After emancipation, black marriage rates had been much higher than white marriage rates. During westward expansion, white marriage rates had kind of gone through the basement. Black marriage rates, after black families who had previously been enslaved and had their marital patterns controlled, either enforced marriages or forbidden marriages, unrecognized marriages, suddenly those marriage rates had gone up. Well, when black communities started getting cut off by government investment in this white middle class, black marriage rates began to fall. So what you get is a moment where you have Friedan exploding out of that white middle class government invested ennui, and 2 years later, the Moynihan Report diagnosing as the source of poverty single black women,
yes,
black, right, and all of and what happened, it also made those experiences between black women and white women indiscernible to each other, and created economic circumstances where, when you're being urged to leave your suburban ennui household and go into a workforce, there is a class setup where you're not renegotiating the deal with your husband, but you are calling on a racialized class of domestic work to come in and do that feminized work for you.
And this was the world you're saying that Betty was trying to change. Only from the women's point, from the white women's point of view.
Right. So
because that was her, that's what it was, and that's what she saw. And let me use this point to jump ahead now to where we are right now. We, as I said, we were quite sure after the passion of the 70s that we had done it. We fixed everything. It was all over. And then we realized, of course, it isn't. Where are we now? What's the most important thing for feminism right now? Is there a chance, or is it a movement, or are there just a bunch of splinters of other things going on? What do you think?
No, we're a movement, and people once again are proud to say, yes, I am a feminist. And what is it that feminists must do? We must get out the vote, and we must work like hell to make sure we get political power and hold it. That's the whole answer. And in the states as well as in the nation.
Well, at the local level is what you're saying.
Right, and the local level and the school boards, it's crucial. Political power is what we need.
Dobbs certainly instigated some of that. What do you think, Brittney? What do you think the most important thing is that's going on? Is there a movement that you see?
Absolutely a movement. I mean, look, this is 2010, 2011 really marks a decade of struggle. In 2010 and 2011, you have Arab Spring abroad, but you have Slut Walk. Slut Walk in 2011 is a global movement. And so when we come into Black Lives Matter, we'd already been in a series of global protests and things bubbling up. Some of that is because of a decade or more of cultivation by folks like Traister and other feminists who are writing online in the early 2000s, who are cultivating the digital space and seeding it with a kind of radical feminist perspective that young people can then latch onto, and it gives them an analysis. So in 2011, you see women stage these slut walks all around the globe. In 2014, then we have the killing of Michael Brown. In 2012, it's Trayvon Martin. We get Black Lives Matter. That's a feminist movement. It's led by 3 feminist folks, right, who come to it and say, we will do better on trans rights. We will elevate women. We will get our gender politics together. And so it's not just a racial justice movement. By 2017, you have Me Too. You also have Trump, and you have the biggest one-day demonstrations around the globe of women protesting the election of Trump. But part of the reason that they know what to do is because we have been in a decade of protest up to that point. And the thing that is really important about 2017 is that when these 2 white women say, we're going to have a women's march, and folks are like, wait a minute, the Million Woman March already happened in 1997, led by Black women. The pivot was amazing, and it reflected the fact that these women who were doing the Women's March had learned the lesson of Slut Walk. What happened with Slut Walk is that Black feminists like my org and other orgs were like, we're not about to call ourselves sluts and go walk around in the streets, because how does that work out for Black women, right? So Slut Walk was torn apart because it did not know how to fully integrate the analysis of intersectionality, right? So Slut Walks really get sort of dissembled. They come quickly, they get dissembled quickly. By 2017, you see the pivot very clearly. Those 2 white women get out of the way. There's a multiracial movement. It gets sustained. So we're in that space, right? And I'm like, why are we not giving ourselves credit for the fact that we have had a decade of movement building that is reflective of these decades of organizing that women have done? So what do I think the problem is now? I think the problem now is that we have a disinformation crisis that we absolutely don't know what to do with. And I think about this a lot in Black communities because I saw your piece, I haven't had a chance to read it yet, about why is the marriage thing coming back around? But it's also all of these pieces, you see them trickling out about how men are very disaffected. They don't have anywhere to go. What is the state of manhood right now? What are men supposed to do? I heard the Biden administration is trying to think about this problem, right? Barack Obama was trying to think about this problem with My Brother's Keeper, that all of the men are disaffected and how do we get them engaged? When really what they're saying is all of these dudes are being radicalized by Trump. And it's not just the white men who were already voting for him. We're seeing the numbers of Black men voting for Trump tick up. We're seeing this radicalization that's happening on YouTube, on Twitter, with trolls, and they're all just sort of I just say that they're just in a collective circle jerk in a digital space, right? And there's no disruption of that. And I don't know. And so the thing that distresses me about it, one of the major tools of feminists, particularly feminists of our ilk, is that we were like, a good argument can carry us very far, right? Friedan makes a compelling, powerful argument. All of us have sort of set our lives to the ability to story a narrative and make an argument and bring people to the table. What do you do in a moment where facts don't matter, story doesn't matter, good arguments don't matter, and the thing that is happening is the kind of rage that is not the righteous rage that Rebecca and I write about, but is this kind of, this backlash rage about the loss of power? Right? Or in the case of Black men, this deep desire and longing for power and this deep rage at Black women. Black men want the power that white men have. White men are continuing to consolidate power at historic levels. Black men see it. They cannot get access to it, right? And so they're mad at Black women. If you guys would just submit, if you would just play your role as wives, if you would just be ladylike, if you would just act like our ideal of white women, then we could get ahead and we could dominate in the world the way white men do.
You're saying this is very much a 21st century problem.
I'm saying that if you Google my name on YouTube, there's a genre of videos of Black men talking all kinds of noise about me for being a feminist. Like, not one video, many videos, right? I'm saying that that Black women are starting to write articles about what we call the Black manosphere, right? That it is
the Black
manosphere. The manosphere is this space in YouTube that is these very retrograde, the worst kinds of ideas that any group of men would have. And you see Black men latching onto those ideas in massive, massive numbers. Last year, a man named Kevin Samuels died unceremoniously. He had amassed a following of millions of people by doing YouTube videos in which he referred to Black people as high-value men and high-value women, or low-value men and low-value women. He was a no-name person who built himself up to a YouTube personality, and I'm saying that he had massive cultural impact because when he died, the New York Times wrote an obituary about him, right? And he promoted the worst kinds of toxic masculinity that we have seen.
How old a person?
He is 51. And his followers were all folks in their 20s and 30s. I was one of the people that he targeted as a low-value woman. Apparently, I'm a low-value woman.
By the way, the high-value, low-value was his decision.
His high value was, do you make six figures, and would you therefore be attractive to a woman who would want to date you because you make enough money to actually support you? It's very profane terms. But the point is, these folks are leading a cultural conversation. They have completely poisoned the waters of Black discourse around partnership, around marriage. There's lots of disarray in Black communities around what to do about this. There was a big story about the rapper Drake this week, this very misogynist album that he recently put out that's more misogynist than he is as a rapper. And the tagline was, he made this album for the Kevin Samuels generation. And so that's what I think we have to combat.
How does that happen? Here we are in October. There's a lot of horrible stuff going on in the world. This is our mission we all care about women. Everyone should care about women. We do. How do we change it? How do we get women to the polls? How do we get Black women to fight against this? Rebecca, pick your favorite. How do we get what? What's the question? Yeah. How do we do it?
Yes, Rebecca, how do we do it?
Well, first of all, you emphasized communication, and there's bad communication as well as good communication.
That's right.
And we've got to get the good communication there, and we've got to fight the bad communication.
Well, social media is a problem.
I was about to say, silence Elon Musk, and we'll be halfway there.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say, listening to Brittney and thinking about this, first of all, I would say that when it comes to getting people to the polls, Black women have been at the polls, are the most reliable voting bloc in the country.
We do right.
And I want to add that it's older people who go to the polls. So there are some of us in this room who vote all the time.
Right. So I would say that one of this, and this, I obviously don't have the solution to how you fight what's happening. We have a media that nobody in this room can wrap our heads around, right? And that actually it's just so diffuse right now, and there aren't controls on it, and you can't. The shifts in our media and how we do communicate with each other have been so quick, and they are so profound that it would be a fool's errand for any of us up here to be like, well, I know what we do about the YouTube situation. Right. None of us know what to do about the YouTube situation.
It's true.
I would say that there's one thing that does strike me thinking about this, including your note at the beginning that you thought after the victories of the 70s that we were done. So one of the great lessons in my life, and Brittney's story about waves and the sort of I think very ultimately destructive story about a women's movement that had happened in bursts and they were distinct from each other and that there wasn't continuity and that those bursts are in fact often defined by white women's victories. So one of the things that I have come to in my own education and growth is a real aversion to any sense that something's done or that a victory is permanent or that a loss is permanent. And I think that especially when I'm thinking about white middle-class women who, again, as we've been discussing, in some ways must be radicalized and energized, one of the most important things we can do is talk more about how long this history is, how it moves forward and backward, especially in this age of Dobbs. It's been something that I've been a little obsessed with, because often you go through periods where white women are lulled, right, by media, by government, into decades of passivity and somnambulance, right? Thinking, in part, that things are done. We're done. It's finished. And I know that I'm a middle-class white woman who is raised on the conviction that, abortion would never, but like Roe would never be overturned, right? Look, we did it. We fixed it. I was not raised on a history that that history is only available to people who have enough comfort and enough resources and enough insulation to be able to not feel the daily realities of not having reproductive access, which was true for millions of people under Roe, right? The Hyde Amendment ensured that and then the past 2 decades of intense state restrictions. People were not able to get the abortion care that they needed under Roe for decades. But amongst white middle-class women, there was a sense it was settled history. And so in communities that are always challenged, that are always marginalized, that don't have access to those kinds of comforts, there's always a sense of ceaseless struggle, and also that you're going to lose more, frankly, than you're going to win. And one of the things that I've noted in my work writing about some of the victories of like in the Trump administration, some of the radicalization and this period of the Women's March being the biggest single day gathering, right, yeah. Tremendous, the Me Too, the sense that there was like, and the healthcare, white suburban women being really engaged in the Senate fight that ended with John McCain doing the thumbs down because they went to the town halls and they screamed and they got engaged and they won. And then there was this moment, which was Kavanaugh's confirmation. And I was out on book tour with my book about women's anger at that point, and it was a terrifying moment for me because here I was out there talking about women's anger and the power of women's anger, and I was on book tour and I was going into rooms of largely a lot of my readership is middle-class white women, and they were like, I can't get out of bed. And it was the month before the 2018 midterms. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? I can't get out of bed because I can't believe he got confirmed. I can't believe he got confirmed. And I went and I banged on the door and I protested, but it didn't work. And I was like, well, of course it didn't work. There's the whole government that this was how it was going to happen. Of course he was going to get confirmed. There was no practice in losing. And I heard it again and again after Dobbs. I don't even know how to get out of bed. How could this have happened? And I've thought so much afterwards that we need to be so much better about the education. Of course that was going to happen, by the way, the day they confirmed Kavanaugh.
You're saying we have to be better politicians. We have to be better
and better historians, and more
and
curious.
To understand the waves of these things and how to make it work.
And how to keep both. 2 things, how to not be stopped by loss and how to not be stopped by victory.
Come on. You preaching. Oh, and I'm a preacher.
She's a real preacher.
Can I say one thing about that? This point is really important, right? For those of us even who have connections to any kind of spiritual tradition, the discipline, the daily discipline of practicing freedom, the daily discipline of getting up and trying again over and over incrementally, even when it doesn't seem like it's whatever the goal is, it's like, well, you want to walk 30 minutes, you start out, you walk 5 minutes, then you walk 10 minutes, right? Yeah. Or Robin DiAngelo in that book, White Fragility, she says like white people don't have any racial stamina. That's why they don't do good in racial conversations. But all of us have to develop the stamina to be able to withstand. The thing about fascism is that it beats you down. It takes away your hope. It makes you feel like you can never win anything. And the reason why I feel uniquely qualified as a Black person to say this is Black people have never had the luxury of laying down and taking it. We literally would be blasted into obliteration if we said, well, they don't want us to be here. They don't want us to be free. They don't want us to have anything. And so that daily discipline of getting up and trying again, my friend Melanie Price says all the time, if you look at the history of Black freedom struggles, we have lost more than we have won. Yeah. But what we continue to do is we continue to get up and fight. And so that is the thing I would say to you, right? I'm going to stop us right there. We need to take a question or two from the audience, and I want to start with a special guest. I don't know where you are, Rachel. Rachel? Okay, Rachel Steyer is in the audience. She is the author of a new, before Muriel's comes out, hers just came out, a new biography of Betty Friedan called Magnificent Disruptor. So welcome to you. Can you sort of tie a bow around all this? How would Betty do you think, about where we are today and what we've been talking about, Rachel?
Where we are today, I don't think Betty would be that happy about where we are today. I don't think that's a surprise to the esteemed panelists. Certainly, she was very concerned about her legacy and worried about it until the very end. And worried that there was unfinished business, so not unlike what you all are talking about, and specifically about women's justice, and worried that just, particularly after, from the time that the Equal Rights Amendment had been lost, which she hoped would be a galvanizing thing for the women's movement, but I really don't think it was as galvanizing as she would have liked. So I think she would not be all that happy about where we are. Yeah. Sum it up for us. What made her book work? What made the movement work as it did at the time? Well, her book or the movement? I mean, those are two. To me, it's hard to really sum that up. I mean, I think her book works because it's, as some of you were saying, it's the first punch. It's the first scream in a popular way. And I would say that everything she fought against is just extraordinary when you read about it, when you read about the reception that she got. Some of it was incredibly gratifying, as Muriel is saying, you changed my life, and then other pieces of it were just humiliating. Yeah. But the book is amazing. And then the women's movement, she tried to get women of different types into one room. It was not completely, as Brittney said, it was not all white. It was there were different types of women, and she tried to get them talking to each other, and I don't think there's any group doing that today. I don't. Yeah.
And if she were here, none of us would have gotten a word in edgewise. I just want to point out.
Yes.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
I wonder
Lynn.
if we have any other questions.
I've been very active in the National Organization for Women, and one thing I can say, and you haven't really mentioned it, but COVID has been very bad for the women's movement in that the daycare centers closed, the schools closed, and all of a sudden traditional roles were sort of forced upon women. The greatest gender gap is really between married white women and married white men. There's a very huge wage gap, and that, of course, in some families, women make more, but in most, they don't. So the women stayed home. What's happening right now in this year and in New York City is that New York City's public daycare system is collapsing because of budget cuts and the lack of any movement. And in Congress, Senator Gillibrand and some congresswomen, especially those who sponsored the Green New Deal, really have tried to get more federal money into daycare, because without that federal money,
right,
the only way that a daycare system can survive is on very low wages. So here we are talking about, the challenge ahead, but a very big challenge is the daycare system is collapsing. The private ones cannot pay the wages that now are required. So the whole system is collapsing, and so more women are going to be forced in the home. So this is one thing I just want to add.
More women back to their traditional roles.
And the impact of COVID.
I once had the privilege of interviewing Justice Ginsburg, and I asked her what was the next step. This was a while back. And she said, nothing will change until childcare changes. Nothing will change until you get that fixed.
And I want to say something about this on a federal level, because I think it's really important to hold both the right and Democrats responsible for the choices that they make around the policy that is so crucial to exactly what you're talking about. So there were a number of very progressive and very feminist economic proposals in the Build Back Better legislation. It was the Biden administration that elected not to fight for child care as part of Build Back Better. And it was Manchin, in part. That's why we don't have the child tax credit, which is so crucial to what we're talking about. We had on the table a child tax credit, which is arguably one of the most important things we could do for families, for women, for children. And we had it as a pen. I mean, there was tremendous, you are right that as far as organizing and COVID and workforce participation, COVID was terrible gender-wise, but the economic policies that were put into effect during the pandemic, including the child tax credit, including expanded unemployment, including certain housing policy breaks, and child care subsidies, were some of the most important economic moves of my lifetime. And it is both the opposition of the right wing, absolutely, but also a failure of will on the part of Democrats that they are not at the absolute center of what we're fighting for when we're talking on state and federal levels about our election conversations.
Let's take two more questions if there are any more. I know everybody. Yes, go ahead.
I think it follows the discussion that working on poverty issues could do a certain benefit to certainly low income. When you think of economic inequality and racism.
Right. Well, working on poverty, I think, it's a given in terms of what.
And I mean, what I would say is that we need to really continue to organize around unions, where the other the place movements have moved. Like, we need the UAW to win as much as they possibly can, right? We need the UAW. Everyone should be saying 32-hour work week, right? Like, they probably won't win it, but the point is that when the auto workers strike, they historically win protections that shift the culture for everyone, right? And they move us towards more livable wages. We had a strike at Rutgers. I was on strike earlier this year at Rutgers. And so we're seeing strikes around the country and around the globe. And one of the things we're also seeing from young feminists, young radicals, is they are saying that they're tired of hustle and grind culture, that they, the lie flat movement in China, the quiet quitting thing here. But I was hearing the seeds of that a couple of years ago when I was out giving a talk and talking to some young organizers, and they were saying, oh, we don't have these ambitions to be all of these great things that you women want to be. And I was like, well, wait a minute now. What do you mean? Whatever do you mean? Right? And they said, no. I just want enough money to be able to support my life and pay my bills and be able to enjoy my life. And I think we've got to figure that thing out, because we have seen, Friedan and many of us who are generations that have come after have seen the ability to be ambitious as the highest achievement, to achieve one's own ambitions and self-actualization as one of the highest achievements of feminist movement building. What we have not been as good at acknowledging is that capitalism is very voracious and very happy for us to toe that line, right? To toe the line of ambition, achievement, careerism, as, it can absolutely co-opt it for its own purposes. And you have young people saying, because here's the thing, because I teach college kids, They're overworked, they're anxious, they're tired, they're burnt out when they step into my classroom because they are under pressure to achieve all of this middle class stuff without the same pathways to achieve it. Right? And so they're divesting, and this is going to change. The way that they work is changing. Their convictions around it are changing. It is going to change. And one of the ways we see it, you've got these old folks who continue to control corporations, who are forcing people back into offices that they don't want to be in.
That's exactly right.
And they think that they're going to win, but they're going to lose, right? The gig economy is going to win. People do not want to be back at work in these office spaces being surveilled by folks who will not update their conceptions of what it means to be a manager. And so you're seeing a slow rebellion, but that it's the first scream, as you said, but it's going to get loud.
And all of this is a feminist issue.
Yes,
I would
it
like
is.
to point out.
The way women work is a feminist
Can I follow up
Sure.
on Brittney really
Sure. We
quickly?
gotta take
Because
one
there's
more
a specific race and gender element to my own lessons on this front, which is that it's in recent years that I have been schooled by my younger colleagues, many of whom are young women or not male identifying people of color, who have pointed out to me, boy, you older white women got scammed. And let's think about this as far, because you were
You're
told.
an older white woman?
Yes. Yes, I absolutely am. I'm 48 years old. And being told, like, you were told that if you worked all the time and you hit every mark within industries that were still fundamentally and remain headed up by and large by white men, but that if you hit every mark and did everything, like all the ambition, all the workaholism, all the answer your emails at whatever time of night or day, that you were going to get something out of this. And this is in the same way we talked about white women being deployed politically, right? They're also deployed as workers to build capital and power for people who are still at the top. Now, does that mean that I'm renouncing my ambition? No. But do I question it? Yes, because I do think about it. Sure, I am an ambitious person who's wanted to achieve. I have tremendous intellectual and professional drives, but I have also been persuaded about the scam.
Right. It ain't gonna
That was
happen.
capitalism.
Yeah.
That's white capitalism and white women's roles in it.
Let me see if there's one more question. And yes, go right ahead.
So I went to Rebecca's event on October 1st in 2018, right after the book. I was the person that came up to you, one of probably many in the whole tour, who was like, they confirmed him. Like, what? What? And that this notion that is blowing my mind, that I said my mind is blown, is like, we have to learn to lose. And I was like new to activism in gun violence prevention after Sandy Hook. But what's Brittney saying about, like, oh my God, I am this spoiled white woman who it's like, oh, but I knocked doors and I phone banked and I did everything right. And how we have to learn to lose. Oh my God. So this sucks. It's like totally sucks, right? And I think, like, we did think, oh, we had a black president, we righted the ship. Oh, we have Roe, we're good. Oh, we defeated Trump, we're good. We are not, right? And now we have Moms for Liberty. Like, now they're going to co-opt women's activism. And now we've got Nikki Haley. What if she's the first woman president? It's like the Phyllis Schlafly.
Nikki Haley would be the first
Rebecca has said,
I have said, Brittney can tell you.
I've always believed the first woman will be a
woman of
Republican.
color. I thought it'd be Nikki Haley. I have long thought that it would be Nikki Haley.
I guess so. Like, do I have a question here? And I guess
You don't
to
have
just
to,
tie it
because-
back to like, it's like the Phyllis Schlaflys are winning. They're doing this work, and they're the Moms for Liberty.
Phyllis Schlafly won. By the way, she never got to be a politician.
So I know. I'm
because she was in service of the white men who had no. Like, that woman was pretty brilliant and horrible. And in another era where she actually did have equal opportunity, she would have been running the Republican Party. But they used her, and she won. And those women, and it's white women standing outside screaming at kids integrating schools. This is not a new problem. So when we talk about learning to lose, to acknowledge all these things that we're talking about here, this has been going on for a long time. And there have been wins.
That's right.
And I think
there have been wins.
They always
despite
win, but sometimes we win too.
Right.
And may I suggest that the next book that you two do together is called How to Lose, which is going to help us all. Ladies and gentlemen, wonderful, brilliant panelists. You are amazing. Thank you. I want to just end with one little note to bring it back to the sort of the concept here, because I do think an evening of How to Lose is a wonderful idea. But I was thinking about how we're talking about how Betty is remembered, and I would say on the whole pretty fondly, even for a lot of mistakes, pretty well. I was reminded that in 1970, on the 50th anniversary of the Women's Suffrage Amendment, I went up to Martha's Vineyard and interviewed a couple of women who had been suffragists, and interviewed them to ask what it was like these days. And they said, and I asked them how they felt about the second wave, what we were doing. And they, of course, referred to it as this women's lib thing, which they didn't understand at all. And one of them said, she told me it really seems ridiculous, she said. And then the other one said, well, maybe that's what they said about us 50 years ago. So I leave you with that thought and the hopes that we will come back and solve even more problems in the future. Thank you all very much. Thank you.